In the business world over the past couple of years, one of the things that I think is a long overdue but hopeful development is an increased focus on diversity. But the question is, how do you make diverse people feel more comfortable once you bring them into the workplace? How do you ensure that your environment is inclusive and that you as a leader are being inclusive? In this video, we're going to talk about that very issue. I'm Dr. Patricia Thompson. I'm a corporate psychologist and executive coach. You can find me at silverliningpsychology.com. And if you'd like to see more videos that I make on topics related to the workplace, then please make sure to like and subscribe. Okay, so before we get into the idea of how to become a more inclusive leader, I'd like to start with some definitions just so that you understand what is diversity and what is inclusion. So diversity is essentially the different characteristics that we bring with us to the workplace. So demographic factors like your gender, your race, your sexual orientation, your gender identity, your physical status, whether you have kids or not. All of those certain things would be aspects of diversity. Inclusion, on the other hand, is how you feel once you're in the workplace. So an inclusive environment is one that feels welcoming. It's one that sets the stage for different sorts of employees, regardless of their background, to be able to be their authentic selves, but also to be able to perform at their best. And so inclusion is really an aspect of how do people feel once they're at work, what's the environment set up like, whereas diversity is just the issue of, how are they different? And the ideal is that you want to have a diverse environment because research suggests that diversity is linked to better problem solving. You're able to bring different perspectives to the fore, but you have to have an inclusive environment really to be able to, harvest the benefits that the diversity brings into your workplace. So if you want to be an inclusive leader who creates a place where people can be able to perform at their best and be able to bring their authentic selves to work and really leverage their strengths in the best possible way, how do you do that? Well, the first suggestion I have is to become aware of your biases. And you'll notice I didn't say become aware if you have biases. I'm basically saying that you have biases. Everybody has biases. It's basically the way that we categorize and make sense of the world. And some of these biases operate unconsciously, and so it can be hard to sometimes be aware of them. The first step of awareness is being aware that you have them, okay? That in and of itself makes you more open to be on the lookout for them. The second thing, actually, which might sound interesting, is to strive against being a good person. Author Dolly True actually argues that if your goal is to be a good person, it might make you more defended against looking at the ways in which you're not good. None of us are perfect. And so if you're looking at yourself as a good-ish person instead, she actually says that that's a better approach, because you'll be able to see yourself as someone who's learning, but someone who's not perfect. And if you can open yourself up in that way, then it can allow you to be in a better space to look at the parts of yourself that you might not be as proud of, or parts that you're actually ashamed of, the ugly parts that maybe you don't want to tell anybody. And that will allow you to, instead of defending against them, get curious about them and try to learn. And that's really instrumental for being able to be aware of your biases. Then, once you have decided to aim to be goodish as opposed to good, the next goal would be to engage in behaviors to help you to uncover your biases. Some things might include doing reading, like anti-racist work can be really helpful for that, or attending a workshop. Another really helpful thing is just to broaden your social network. A lot of times, if you were to think about the 5 people who are closest to you, who are not your family members, you might find that a lot of them are very similar to you. And so if you want to broaden your perspective, it really behooves you to have a diverse set of people who you're close to. So develop relationships with people who don't look like you, or people who are different, or people who have different religions or cultures or things like that. Because as you develop those relationships, what happens is that you develop empathy for people who are different from you, and it broadens your perspective of who becomes your in-group versus your out-group, and that will help you to conquer some of your biases. The other thing that you want to look out for in terms of biases is whenever you have knee-jerk reactions to things, take a step back and think, is part of this because I'm biased? For example, if a woman did something, let's say a Black woman did something and you reacted a certain way, take a step back and think, would I react that same way if it were a white man doing that? Or are there biases that are coming to the fore that are affecting how I am gauging a certain situation? So those are just some quick tips to kind of start to look at your biases. Obviously, getting rid of your biases is not a quick process, but the more that you're open to discovering and being curious and learning, the more likely it is that you'll be able to interrupt your own biases. The next thing you'll want to do is create a welcoming environment. And it makes me think of a funny story. Actually, it's not that funny, but when I was early on consulting, my very first consulting trip was to meet with the CEO. I was going with my boss, and it was someone who was the CEO of a health system. And so we're going through the hall to his office, and we're passing all the former presidents of the health system, and of course they were all old white men. And then we get into his office, and on the walls were Civil War battle scenes, and he had various Civil War memorabilia on his desk and at various places in his office. And so, as you can imagine, as a Black woman in there, immediately the environment didn't feel welcoming, and it raised some questions for me in terms of how much my opinion would be valued. And, you know, whether or not it was valued isn't even necessarily the question here. I mean, it's part of the question, but I think even more importantly is just from the standpoint of inclusion, I didn't feel like I could be my authentic self there. I didn't feel as comfortable there as someone else might who, you know, had his same background. And the environment was basically set up to be welcoming to a certain subgroup of people, but maybe not everyone. And so if you want to be an inclusive leader, you've got to be really thoughtful about how you make the environment welcoming. And one thing is just from an aesthetic standpoint, is it welcoming? Do you have different cultures reflected in your building? Are there diverse people, for example, that are showed up on your website or in your social media or things like that? Just those small steps can help people to feel like they're more welcome and that they're coming to a space that's safer, where people like them are going to be valued. Some other things that you can do to be more welcoming would include things like asking people about their cultural backgrounds and you know, what kind of holidays they might have, to make sure that you're not scheduling meetings on holidays that might create conflicts for people. Ask people how to pronounce their names and then learn to pronounce it correctly. Ask people what their pronouns are. On my Zoom and my LinkedIn profiles, I actually have my pronouns after my name. And so that lets people know that that's something that I'm aware of and that, you know, they can ask me about or that they can talk about. You can do things like potlucks. Really what your goal is to make sure that there's a space where everyone is recognized and valued. And so asking your employees about what's important to them and making sure that there's space for it in the workplace, you know, as is appropriate, would be something that you can do to be a more inclusive leader. My next tip is to make sure that the meetings that you're holding are inclusive. You know, meetings are the space where people come together to solve problems, to talk through issues, and to brainstorm. And so that's where you can really leverage the strengths of diversity. But if everybody isn't getting a chance to get their voice heard, then you're missing out on some opportunities. And so here are some best practices for having inclusive meetings. The first one actually is to send out your agendas ahead of time. And that one's actually, I think, beneficial for everyone, but it especially helps out the introverts, because a lot of times an introvert needs a little bit more time to process and to get their thoughts together. And so if they have a heads up in terms of what they can be expecting during the meeting, then you give them the opportunity to kind of think about it ahead of time. And then when they come to the meeting, they can be more ready to go. The second thing I would say is, as a leader, if you're chairing the meeting, pay attention to who's speaking and who isn't. If you find that there are people who are dominating the meeting, then you want to make sure that you make space for the people who maybe aren't speaking up as much. You could ask them specifically for their opinions, or maybe outside of the meeting, say something like, I typically don't hear from you very much, but I would love to hear your perspectives. Would you be willing to voice your opinions during the meeting? You can also, check in on the people who are quieter, maybe near the end of a topic, so that if they're introverts, they will have had that chance to process and get their thoughts together. But that's a really important meeting best practice. And kind of in a related vein, I would say watch out for interrupting. Research has found that men are much more prone to interrupt and that women are much more prone to be interrupted. And so in order to make sure that you're making adequate space for the women in your room, make sure that there's a no interruption policy, and that if someone is interrupting, you stop them and you say something like, hey, Mary is still speaking. Let's let her finish her point. And then, you make sure that she has adequate time for the floor. Another practice, and this one can also relate to women and also minorities, is to make sure that the appropriate person is getting credit for the ideas. Sometimes what will happen in a meeting is that someone will present an idea, no one will really build on it, it'll kind of go unnoticed, and then later on someone else will bring up the idea, and all of a sudden everybody's getting engaged around it, and that person tends to get kind of the psychological credit for that. So if you are a manager in charge of that group, one of the things that you can do is to say, hey, Bill or Bob, whoever, great point. That really builds on the point that Mary made earlier. Thank you so much. Mary, did you have anything else that you wanted to add with respect to that? And therefore you're making sure that she has space, she's getting validation and appreciation for her ideas, and the group is acknowledging who actually brought up the point. One last thing you could do in meetings is to send out an email that kind of talks about everything that was covered in the meeting, and you could ask if people have any follow-up ideas. Some people hate to do that because they don't want to have a meeting after the meeting, but I would say for particularly important things where you want to get people's best thinking, that can be helpful, because I hear so many people say, you know what, I got like the best idea after the meeting, but I wasn't able to say anything about it. And so again, that gives a forum for them so that they can get their views out, and the team wins because they have better information on which to base decisions. Okay, the next tip I would like to talk about is making it easy for people to market themselves. So one of the things that we know in business is that people who promote themselves appropriately by talking about their accomplishments tend to be the ones who get raises, they're the ones who tend to get promotions, and they're the ones who tend to get ahead. Yet what you find is there are often cultural and gender differences in terms of how willing people are to do that. There's actually research also that has found that women, when they do that, are perceived as less likable. So, I mean, it's kind of a no-win situation. And so to guard against that as a leader, what I recommend is that during your one-on-one sessions with people, ask them, tell me about the things you're working on that you're really proud of, or what's been one of your biggest accomplishments since we last met, that sort of thing. Because what that allows you to do is give them a forum to be able to market themselves. And then when you're talking with your leaders, you can be marketing your people too. But if you don't know what they're doing, then you can't market them in the same way. So just as a best practice, ask those questions during meetings. It'll help you to get a better sense of the pulse of your team, but it'll also help you to make sure that people's accomplishments aren't being overlooked. The last thing I would like to say as a tip is, I almost didn't say it because I felt like it went without saying, but I think I have to say it, is to have a no tolerance policy for behavior that is not inclusive. And so if someone says a microaggression, call it out. Let them know, hey, this is offensive and this is why. or if someone is engaging in behavior that you know isn't inclusive, then make sure that you take them to the side and let them know that that's not tolerated. You know, if it's an honest mistake, then you can educate them about it, let them know why their behavior isn't helpful to the team. And, you know, what we say is a call in, it's a learning opportunity. I would say if something's egregious, then you got to call it out and let the person know that that won't be tolerated. Because the more you let those little things go, the more they become appropriate in some people's minds. I actually heard a podcast with John Amici on it. He's an ex-basketball player who is now an organizational psychologist. And he said that the culture is often defined by the worst behavior tolerated. And so make sure that there's no bad behavior tolerated so that your team can come to work feeling safe, feeling included, and feeling welcomed. So anyway, those are a few tips that I hope you can put into practice immediately to help you to be a more inclusive leader. As I said, if you want to learn more strategies to be more effective in the workplace, stay tuned to the channel. I also have a lot of courses. I have courses on emotional intelligence, leadership, resilience, mindfulness, accountability, a lot of different business topics. So you can check those out on my Silver Lining Psychology website. And as always, don't forget to click the bell, like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.